when their party doesn't win an election. This is an insult to the memory of those who lost their lives trying to exercise the right to vote, given to them in the 15th Amendment in 1870.
Do you know the name of the black person that was disenfranchised and wasn't allowed to vote down in Florida?
No, I don't know one. I think it's bogus. I think it's silly. I think that there are all types of local problems when it comes to elections, but that's not just in Florida. That's in New York City, Harlem, out of all the black congressional caucus members, I guarantee you that blacks, either voters or potential opposition and candidates, that there's more disenfranchisement that goes on in those districts than in any other district in the nation. There's no doubt in my mind about that.
One of the things that the Democrats did in the wake of losing this recount war was they played the race card. When in doubt, play the race card. And they said that blacks had been disenfranchised by these, jackbooted thugs of Jeb Bush, the president's brother, the president-elect's brother, had turned away blacks from polling places as if there were these barricades that said no blacks allowed, And it's absolute nonsense. The U.S. Civil Rights Commission, run by Mary Frances Berry, who is a strident liberal activist, held extensive public hearings in the wake of the recount wars to show ostensibly that blacks had been disenfranchised. And they held hour after hour of these hearings and had testimony, and when I watched them very carefully and I paid very close attention, and I kept waiting for a black person to stand up and say, yeah, I went to the polls and I was turned away because I'm black and they didn't want me to vote, And let me tell you something. If that had happened, that would have been obviously very wrong, and we would know about it. We would not only know about it, we'd know that person's name. The reason we don't know of a name is because there is no name. They couldn't come up with anybody. Believe me, I looked for it. As a straight news reporter, I was willing to put that in my book and put that in my reporting, and believe me, everybody else in the press would have put that person's name out there. The person doesn't exist.
Where the Democratic control electoral officers put these sample ballots in the paper, sent out sample ballots, had Democratic workers there working with the people to vote, and because they couldn't vote, it was Republicans' problems.
Democrats often complain that blacks make up the lion's share of the military, and they do most of the fighting and dying for the United States of America. But when Gore realized that he was losing this election, he actually waged a campaign to throw out the military ballots that had been cast by members of our armed services serving overseas. These absentee ballots that had been sent in, and traditionally military people tend to vote Republican. Gore knew this. He had attorneys, Democratic attorneys in all 67 counties, wage a concerted campaign to disqualify as many military ballots that had been cast absentee as possible. And they actually put out a memo that explained how to challenge military ballots. There was a guy who was actually over in the Middle East at the time of the election. Meanwhile, 8,000 miles away in his hometown of Jacksonville, Florida, two Gore lawyers are at the Board of Elections successfully arguing that his ballot that he had cast from his ship at sea should be disqualified. They succeeded in getting it disqualified. These two Gore lawyers high-fived each other.
Where you have a lack of competition, where you have a lack of a competitive two-party system, which is the case in the majority of these black districts in the Congressional Black Caucus, you have dictatorship. You have essentially political dictatorship, and you have the ability of those incumbents in power to disenfranchise not only voters, but potential candidates. So that even if voters are not disenfranchised, they only have like good old-fashioned Soviet-style elections. You have one candidate running for office and one option.
After the election was over, and after all the recounts were over and Bush was declared the rightful winner, the media, not satisfied, they went in and said, we're going to count all these votes. And so a variety of media organizations staged media recounts. Guess what? Virtually all of them concluded that Bush would have won anyway. Even the New York Times, which conducted the mother of all media recounts, and it was with a bunch of other news organizations, Washington Post, CNN, they said Bush would have won anyway.
Let my people go, go down.
The divisions in the nation and between the two major political parties are no longer about race, but moral values and the freedom to practice and express one's religious views. Millions of people are escaping the crumbling plantations and riding the Underground Railroad to individuality and self-determination. It is running specifically for those who have been silenced with pejoratives and intimidated with character assassinations and who are now speaking up and speaking out.
You know, I always tell people that I was born a Baptist, I was born a Democrat. I don't ever remember making the choice. I was born that way. I moved to Los Angeles, and I realized at the age of 18 that I really didn't know how to deal with life, the issues of life. I had an emptiness within me, a void. I was very emotional, I had a lot of doubt, and I didn't know how to deal with life. So I started to look for the answers in some of the black churches around the city, because I was told that if you go to church, you know, you can find the answers. But instead of telling me how to overcome the problem, they said, you know, it's the white man, it's racism, they're trying to hold you back. Then I started listening to Louis Farrakhan. I used to go to his meetings when I was a young man, and he would get you all excited. You know, he would tell us that you're kings and queens from Africa, you're the first on the earth, and everybody else came from us as black people. And so we would be hooping and hollering and right on, you know. And while we were so emotional, we way up here, he would say, well, you know, that old blue-eyed devil, he's trying to hold you back. Or that blood-sucking Jew, you know, they are against you. And so we would go from a high to a low. And in that state of anger, we would go out and kill for him if he had asked us to do it. And so I suffered a lot from that. I started hating white folks because I believed that lie. And then long story short, I ended up on drugs. You know, I started smoking marijuana and stuff like that. And while on drugs, I was told that this country owes us something. If you're on drugs and you're black, you could go over to social service and tell them that you can't work because you're on drugs, and they would take care of you. So I ran down, and they gave me $300 in food stamp, in cash, $100 in food stamp. They paid my rent. They just took care of me, and I got worse instead of getting better. But what started me off is that I started to question things. You know, and after a while I thought, you know, I've gotten worse instead of getting better. And I looked at Jesse Jackson and others. They were blaming the white man while at the same time they were doing well. Their children were going to the best schools. They lived in the best neighborhoods. So I started thinking, well, if the white man is holding us back, why is it that they're not holding these folks back? How come they're getting away with it? And they were not teaching us how to overcome, but they were overcoming. And once I started to question things, that's when answers start to come.
I would not have identified myself politically at all during that time. And in fact, this was during the early 80s when I was living on welfare, and Ronald Reagan was the president, and I didn't even know it. Not only did I not know he was president, I didn't know he was my governor prior to that. So I was very, very distant from anything in the political world. I lived the street life. There was just no connection between anything in policy, anything in academia, or anything outside of my little circle of hanging out at Venice Beach all afternoon getting high.
And so then I saw that the whole race grievance industry began to calcify around the civil rights movement. And also the poverty industry, poverty Pentagon, as it began to calcify around the poor blacks. The Republican Party, by contrast, was the party of business, the party of free enterprise, the party of empowerment. And so I made a strategic change to reflect the strategic needs of the people that I care about most, and they were low-income blacks and low-income people.
Once I disclosed that I was Republican and the paper picked it up is when I started receiving hate mail from Democrats and people that told me that I was a sellout and that it was the tradition of black people to be Democrat. Up until that time, I didn't really think much about it.
The Republican Party has either not told its story well, or its story has been hidden and contained by the liberal media. There would be no Voting Rights Act if it hadn't been for Republican Senate and House members. There would not be the legislation we have today. It was Republicans who stood up for that stuff. The Democrats were the racists back in those days. It was a Democratic South, and those Democratic governors were the racists. But again, you know, history has been kind of rewritten.
The Republican Party in Texas was started on the 4th of July, 1867 in Houston, Texas by 150 blacks and 20 whites. It was that way across the South. The Republican parties were started in the South by African Americans. In the state of Texas, 2 of our first 3 statewide Republican chairmen were African American. The first 42 black legislators elected in Texas were all Republican. The first 112 black legislators elected in Mississippi were all Republican. The first 190 black legislators elected in South Carolina were all Republican. The first 41 in Georgia, the first 127 in Louisiana. So now you've got all these African Americans really stepping up and starting to gain political standing, political power. Now, you have Democrats on the other side who have been very racist. It's in their platforms. They support the Dred Scott decision. They think the fugitive slave law is great. They started a nation to keep slavery alive. Very racist. And so now they're facing a situation where that these blacks are now their rulers, are now in office, are now U.S. senators, are now U.S. How do you stop that? 1866, Democrats themselves started the Ku Klux Klan. Its purpose was not to kill blacks. Its purpose was to take control and return Democrats to power. Their stated purpose in the KKK was to stop Republicans and restore Democratic control. Now, if you're looking for a Republican that you want to take care of, you can wipe out any black you want because they're 100% Republicans at that point in time. You can't wipe out any white. I mean, some whites might be Democrats. You got to be a little more judicious when you're wiping out whites. So what happens is the Ku Klux Klan starts attacking, not blacks, Republican conventions. For example, in New Orleans, in the Republican convention in Louisiana, the Klan joined with the New Orleans police, joined with the New Orleans mayor, Democrats. They attacked physically at the convention in New Orleans, Republican convention. They killed 40 blacks, killed 20 whites, they wounded 150 others. In 1868, they put out a push card in South Carolina, and it listed what they call the radical members of the South Carolina legislature. That push card's about the size of a baseball card. It was put up by the Klan. Klan put it out. It had the pictures of 63 legislators that needed to be wiped out in South Carolina. 50 of those legislators were black, 13 were white. Now, they were all 63 Republican. On the back of the card, it gave you the name of each legislator so you'd know who you're trying to kill. Congress starts these hearings in this group called the Klan. And they have hearings, and so they bring in Democrat leaders that under oath from these Democrat states said, yes, the Klan belongs to our party. It's actually in Congress. 1872, the hearings, it's a 13-volume set of hearings in Congress. Unequivocally, Democrats say the Klan is ours and belongs to us. It's there to restore Democrat control in the southern states. Those guys who lived through it made it very clear. For example, one of the early black congressmen was John Roy Lynch. Another early black congressman was Richard Cain. And they're having to fight the Klan physically for their own safety. They go armed to Congress because of the Klan attacks. These guys said, if we as blacks would simply stop voting the Republican ticket, if we would agree to vote the straight Democrat ticket, all the violence against us would be stopped.
In 1964, incidentally a year that 3 of our civil rights workers were killed in Mississippi registering blacks to vote, was also the year that civil rights legislation, historic civil rights legislation, was being promoted, and President Johnson wanted to sign it, but nevertheless it was held up, bottled up in the United States Senate by Southern Democrats. And one Democrat in particular, who was the last individual to try to obstruct this legislation, was a guy named Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia, who for 14 hours and 13 minutes held a filibuster against the civil rights legislation.
Senator Robert Byrd used the nigger word 3 times on a national televised TV show. No outcry at all. Nobody said a thing, at least from the Democrat. No, the Black Caucus didn't say anything, the NAACP, no outcry.
There's no price to pay